All right, we're recording, and I'm with Madeline Davis. Uh, Madeline, talk to us a little bit about where you are in your author journey.
Uh, So I'm not yet published, but hoping to with some short stories. And this is my first full-length novel project. But I've been writing
Nice.
kind of since I couldn't write. I have stories that I just scribbled the lines, because clearly the characters in the picture had a story to tell.
That's awesome.
um, and I think that does drive a lot of my writing. I'm very character-driven, but I'm hoping to hone my craft so I can actually publish something worth
Very cool.
reading.
Okay, that's awesome. Well, what you sent me is worth reading. So feel like you are on the right track. It is a great first chapter. Um, where is this is your first, you said your first attempt at a full-length novel.
Right. Well, not first attempt, but the first
Okay.
one that I think I can finish. I have the
Okay.
whole thing mapped out. I don't have all the parts written yet, but I've tried to write a number of novels and stopped them for various reasons. Mostly because I felt like I didn't actually own the subject matter, and this one I think I do have enough picture of the whole thing, and then it's appropriate. Like I'm almost mature enough to touch some of the themes I want to touch.
We're never mature enough to touch the themes we want to touch. Yeah.
Yeah.
It never happens.
Right.
Yeah, okay, so that's great. Let's jump into it together. I'm gonna share my screen, and maybe I'm gonna share my screen. There we go. Can you see the chapter up here?
Yeah, lovely.
Perfect. Okay. So the first thing, you're this is kind of historical fantasy, right? With so we're in the age of like kings and queens. Um
Yes.
Kings and Queens and Dragons. Uh, and you start off with this very well-written sword fight. That the princess is watching her brother and this guy who's courting her hand go after, and she's got Lady Marianne sitting next to her.
Yes.
And we've got these like first several blocks of prose, which isn't bad. I usually tell authors like, hey, five blocks of exposition at a time before you get characters really talking. So
Mm.
you slide a one-liner, two-liner in there after five, but then you get right back into prose. So I don't think I'm going to count your two-liner. So you have about eight or nine blocks of exposition before we get into it. Now, it's very well written, and it's an action scene. Um, and it's a little problematic, as you pointed out in one of the comments I made. It's a little problematic to get people talking, uh, because A, they're wearing helmets, which no helmets, but we can talk about that in a minute. So A, they're wearing helmets, and B, they are kind of far away from the crowd, and you're in the crowd's POV. Um, Talk to me about how important these characters are. We've got Eleanor, Raymond, the Count, and the sorry, I keep Marianne. Which ones of these are we going to see more of?
The Prince Raymond is actually, I would say, a co-MC.
Okay.
Um, the next chapter will be from his perspective,
Okay.
and it'll keep alternating. So
Okay.
the story is both of them, but this is supposed to be the princess's introduction, and
Okay.
he's a stronger character, so he kind of tends to steal thunder. So um, I wanted to make sure the princess was fully established before he came across too strong.
That's very smart.
Um, if she comes across strong, I'm glad because his chapters are different.
Yeah, no, that's very smart. Do we see the Count or Marianne again?
Not the Count, and Marianne, not very much. They're both more token characters rather than actually significant in themselves. So um, they both kind of signify like the other suitors that Eleanor has had who are really awful. And then Marianne is, in the line of people who try to pretend to be her friend and turned out to just have their own agenda. So as particular characters, they will show up again in minor ways, but not terribly significantly as themselves. So they have names, and I think they needed names, but I don't want people to get too much like, oh yes, antagonists, because they're not main antagonists.
Okay. So the reason I'm asking these questions is because we need to break this up. We need to get them talking. I had set down here. So this is pretty, just to let you know, this is pretty common in what I see in an action scene, right? When somebody sends me an action scene, it's the back and forth between the people fighting. And it's like he struck and then he parried and then he closed in. And you've done a really good job with it. Like, you know, the duelists seem to be assessing each other. The count made a feint and then an offensive move. The prince met it with a firm parry, right? Like that's a great sentence. It very much like depicts the action. Like I can imagine what's going on. The problem is it's not the physical give and take that's engaging. Um, it's the banter that happens while the give and take is going on, that actually like pulls somebody in. So if you think about any of the like, I mean, movies are the easiest to look at because it's the language we kind of all share. If you think about The Princess Bride, because this is very much in the like thing of The Princess Bride. When Wesley and Inigo Montoya are fighting, the sword play is fun, but what we're really in it for are their like back and forth, right? It's their like, you know, talking to each other that makes that scene super memorable, like it makes that scene unforgettable. So we want to get somebody here talking. I had recommend, and you can tell you've got them going back and forth just by glancing at it on the page. So this is kind of what it looks like when they're not talking. This is more what it would look like if they were talking, right? You can see how there's like and I'm actually gonna, Madeline, in a second, I'm gonna recommend we go a different way after what you just told me about the characters. But you can see that there's like a back and forth, and then you have both characters reply to each other. And I wrote a reply that's just a sneer, right? Like he doesn't even need to say anything. We just need the exchange of emotion between the characters because it's that exchange of emotion that we as the reader feel, right? And then we need another paragraph of like a short paragraph of, well, this short paragraph is Eleanor and what she's doing. But then because there's really, now that we really think about it, there's 5 players in this scene. There's the 2 people fighting, there's Eleanor, there's Marianne, and then there's the crowd. So we got to think about this as like a chorus scene where you've got kind of 4 speakers and 1 giant chorus around them. But here again, you get that like the count made an aggressive attack, another less graceful parry from Raymond, and then I want them immediately talking to each other, right? Like, so when you write fight scenes in the future, know that like this is like you got to get them talking, because what happens if you don't is the reader starts to skim, and all that really great exposition you wrote is lost because the reader starts just kind of like, okay, they're fighting, when are we getting to? And what the reader can't, what the reader doesn't necessarily vocalize out loud is, when are we getting to the part that I actually want to read, which is the characters interacting. And we think because they're trading blows, it's interaction, but there's very little emotion shown in that. It's more told. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Originally, I actually didn't describe very much of the duel because I didn't want the focus to be on the duel. I mean, it's happening, but I wanted it to be more of introducing Eleanor.
Yeah.
And I kind of got some feedback of like, oh, well, you know, there's a duel happening. I might like to see it, which seemed understandable. I mean, it's, you know,
It's
a
fun.
part of the scene, but I'm just mostly, I guess, from Eleanor's perspective, not even just from the technical, like what can she hear, but like how interested is she in that, since
Yeah.
it's her introduction, I'm afraid of taking emphasis off of her.
Yeah,
But
no,
I see what you mean about making it engaging so that people are actually reading it.
yeah, and I would say right now, this is, and I'm after talking to you about it, I would back out my comments and go a different direction. So I would say right now, Eleanor is very passive in her own introduction until we get to the scene with her mother. So we have this fight scene. She has a quick conversation with her brother. She then has a longer conversation with her mother. Then she's back in her own room, right? Um, and she meets, yeah, I don't know, this kind of stereotypical wizard. So, I don't know if that's who he is in the story, but that's kind of how he plays out in his introduction. So instead of, because this is Eleanor's introduction, we need to get her more active, not just passively watching, but we need to get her engaging. So rather than having Raymond and his core and the Count talk, I'm going to encourage you to get a conversation here between Eleanor and Marion. Later, the mother mentions that Marion has her own kind of devices, and Eleanor is a little sad because she seems to like the fact that somebody, is it that she likes the fact that somebody's paying attention to her? Is that
Yeah, that somebody seemed to be more personally interested in her. That yeah, she could have somebody who sees her as a friend and not just the princess.
okay? Perfect. So, as you said, Marianne doesn't really come back. She kind of disappears.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, there's a distance whenever she does appear again that she's not significant to the rest of the plot per se.
Okay. So we want to make Marianne into a hazard character, which means she's a character that only shows up a couple times, and she's a character that we're going to use to tell us about Eleanor. Right. So Marianne doesn't need a lot of depth. We're not going to have any character change for Marianne. We're not going to worry about like a lot of modulation for Marianne. She just needs to be a big voice that shows up that allows us to let Eleanor play off of her. So, what do you want after this first chapter, when the reader's done with Eleanor? Like the readers had her first Eleanor POV, because you said Raymond's a pretty big voice and he might overshadow her. So we get done with Eleanor's POV. What do you want us to feel about Eleanor?
That she isn't actually as strong as she could be a character, but that there is potential
Okay.
for the grow, but mostly sympathizing, I guess, with her situation and that, yeah, she's a lonely princess in
Okay.
some ways.
Lonely
And
princess who isn't as strong as, when you say strong, what do you mean by strong?
um, not as, I guess, decisive and secure in who she is as princess. She doesn't quite understand her role, really, and isn't secure in her relationships with her brother, with her mother, and with her people, more generally speaking.
Okay. So we want a princess who isn't secure in who she is, in her role and in herself. Um, what can Marianne, because so what you're describing is somebody who gets talked at a lot. She's going to get talked at. So when we talk about like her character voice and we talk about like how she participates in a conversation, it needs to be much like what you're doing with her mother, where people say things to her and then she responds. Does that make sense? And then later on in the book, when she starts to take agency, you want to flip that and you want to have her start to lead conversations because that'll demonstrate her self-confidence coming around, and that she finally starts to speak rather than responding to other people and letting them pull her around. She starts to take the reins in conversation by leading the conversation and making declaratory statements about how she feels. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's it.
How does that feel?
It sounds a little weaker in a way that I mean, I want to make sure the potential for her is clear, and she's not bad at being a princess. She's just tired of being diplomatic all the time. So she knows how to make the conversation and how to do the things, but she would rather perform, I guess. A
Yeah,
balance that I want to show.
what you're doing right now that's really good is she has a strong interior voice. So you're gonna build her like potential with her interior voice. We need, much like you do with her mother, with the mother's conversation. Let's scroll down there for a second. Um, her interior and exterior voice changes with her mother. So, like, for example, um, no, that's the brother. That's where she's talking. Here we go.
It's the third issue.
Am I there
Yeah,
yet?
that's the third issue. So yeah, just right after that.
Right after that. Okay. Yeah, here we go. So Princess Eleanor, her mother. So we have this nice thing here where she's looking at the tapestries, and kind of taking in the room, and we get kind of how she feels about it. And then Princess Eleanor, her mother's even tone commanded. So this is great because her mother leads the conversation, right? The princess turned and walked toward the table. Behind it sat the queen and Ramron straight, her white widow's wimple tightly hiding her hair, and her dark brow drawn as she studied a handful of documents spread out before her. Great description, right? Like, I can, few words, you're letting me see what's happening in the room. I get a picture of what's going on. The queen nodded and they separated out, leaving Eleanor alone with her mother. That last line has some foreboding to it. It's very nice. Again, mother leads off. You know why I summoned you. Eleanor nodded, swallowing. She stared at the floor and noticed his rushes would be changed here in a few days. Another task to attend to. So that interior voice right there is great because you're showing us, like, hey, she notices things, she understands her role, and another task to attend to. But you'll notice her exterior voice, Eleanor nodded, swallowing, is this kind of, I'm a little lost in this. Does that make sense? The queen sighed, and yet you do not understand. Eleanor looked up, trying to think of an answer, but the queen spoke first. This is the perfect voice that you want all through this first piece as an introduction to her. When the daughter of Perry and Brittany, did you think any, I'm not going to read the name because I'll screw it up, began to befriend you, did you think any other purpose she might have? Eleanor bit her lip and looked down. Of course, the queen would think Marianne first in relation to the rebellious baron, right? Like, again, nice, like, I understand what's going on, but I'm not speaking up. I'm holding my tongue, right? Because there's this reluctance in what you were saying in, like, agency that she's going to develop through the book. So
Okay.
I want to take, but she's got that strong interior voice that you're noting. That's like, she knows what's going on. She's just tired and she doesn't quite understand how she fits into it, but she gets it. So I want this Eleanor in this fight scene. Because right now in this fight scene, Eleanor just watches and she thinks about things, but there's nobody interacting with her. She's just kind of telling us what's going on with the day. So rather than have Raymond and the Count talking, we need Marianne's voice in here, and we need Eleanor responding to Marianne. And in the same way we were breaking it up below with Raymond and the Count, where they have a little bit of action and then two people talk, that's what we want here for Raymond and Marianne, for Marianne and Eleanor. And by doing that, you're going to shift the focus of the fight back onto the character that you actually want to be. It's going to feel more like Eleanor is watching a fight while we're getting to know Eleanor, rather than there's a fight happening that Eleanor is watching. Does that make sense?
Yes, and that is, yeah, exactly what I wanted
Okay.
for the idea.
So let's look practically how to do that, right? You've got this great opening. Clang, the swords of the two armored duelists first made contact in the castle courtyard, rang with sound. There's little noise to compete with, of course. The spectators, about half the Queen Regent's court, watched quietly enough, even if they weren't exactly holding their breath. Scattered along the edges of marked off space, they watched the class with the attention, if not interest. Marianne speaks right here. Marianne turned to Eleanor and said, and whatever conversation they can have in which you can display Eleanor's, like, I understand that this isn't the best, but I like somebody talking to me, right? I probably would make it about the Count because you have a lot in here about her feelings about Raymond's battles with these guys when they're showing up for her hand and how she doesn't actually care. So I would have Marianne trying to woo her with her like conversation about the man fighting her brother. And then you'll be able to take a lot of these details. Her elder brother, Crown Prince Raymond, fought with her in view, while the audacious suitor, who is now Count somebody de Margerac. So I would have Marianne say something like, oh, this one. I mean, this one's really fine, isn't he? And then Eleanor can think, right? Like Raymond fought with him in view. Count, I don't even remember his like. Sorry, it's in third person. Raymond fought with him in view. Eleanor couldn't quite remember his name, Count de Margerac or something. You know, it's very nice, she replied. And then have Marianne be like, I hear he has huge tracts of land, right? Like that kind of like her trying to like ingratiate herself to Eleanor by commenting on how amazing it is that she has these suitors. And then when you get to these back and forths that they have between each other, right? The duelists seem to be assessing each other. The Count made a feint and then a more offensive mood. The Prince met it with a parry, right? Then you can have Marianne say something like, oh, it looks like the Count's going to strike out here. I hope he doesn't hurt your brother. And then you can take these thoughts up here that Eleanor currently has about my brother's just screwing with these guys. Give her that interior thought, and then let her say something more passive, like it is quite exciting, right? Like, and so now, do you see how, like, by putting the words in her mouth, getting her interacting with somebody, we're going to get a better picture of who she is in the
Right. And
book.
the contrast
And
too.
the contrast, yeah. And like, and you're setting up her, what I love about what you've done with her mother that I want you to pull up here. Unlike with her mother, she's not going to be afraid of Marianne.
Right.
Right? Like she's just not gonna, you're gonna get more of that tired, like, I don't know what to do. I really just want this to wrap up. Right. And so you can still get the same thing in the end where she wraps it up a little early and Raymond's kind of, you know, hacked about it a little bit. But by giving us, so sorry, we want that same like back and forth with her mother, not scared, but by giving us a courtier for her to talk to, we just get another take on her. That's what I was going to say. And what I love about it is that you're setting up her wound from the very beginning, right? Like, this is who we're going to have to heal. She's got a deep internal voice. She's got lots of thoughts, but instead of sharing those thoughts and actually like taking charge of the conversation with the obnoxious Marianne, she just says things like, it is exciting, right? Like, and the reader's going to be like, oh, she's got to speak up, right? Like, so you'll drive that wound for the character development through the larger story. How does all of that feel?
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And I like that. Yeah. I could see it being harder to write, but also more fun, right?
No.
In some ways.
So let's talk about Marianne's voice for a minute. What is, and I'm going to warn you, when you start writing in this way, where you're like building these hazard characters, you're going to like some of them and start bringing them back more than you think you will. But
Yeah.
what is a voice that Eleanor would find amusing? Because we don't want Marianne to be like obnoxious, because later the mom's like, you can't talk to her. And Eleanor's kind of sad about it. She's like, I kind of like talking to her. So we need it big but amusing. Try to think of another character in something you've watched or read from Eleanor's perspective that Eleanor would be like, oh, that person is entertaining.
I mean, I think I would want her to sound like she's actually intelligent about the fight, at least. She has to have seen something also. So I don't want her making super obvious comments again, then, I guess. But yeah, a good comparison. Um, I'm thinking mostly of a Jane Austen like side character, probably in Northanger Abbey, who comes
Okay.
across as a little brash to the main character, who's
Yeah.
similarly, yeah, and they have fun combos.
Yeah. But the key of that brashness is that they have to be brash in a way that's in agreement with the character.
Right.
Right, because Austin also has brash characters that are just obnoxious, like the priest, and you're just like, I don't want to be more of him on the page. But so you got to be brash in a way that's like Marianne is connecting to Eleanor in these ways, so that if at some point it is revealed that Marianne has these like ulterior motives, you can imagine Eleanor kind of being sad about it, like, oh, that's unfortunate. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if that were the case, she might know that Raymond is the better swordsman.
Mm-hmm.
And that the Count, yeah, is really not really
Yeah.
there. I mean, part of why I had that was like her one thing was that she sounds like she doesn't quite know that, but maybe making that a little clear that yeah, she understands what the fight is actually about.
Yeah, and I think I might play it so that she's commenting negatively about the suitor and like joking with Eleanor about the suitor, kind of saying what Eleanor feels, but Eleanor's is a little too stationed to say. Does that make sense? That's the kind of brashness that'll connect us to, that would connect Eleanor to her. Like, if she says, like, how many of these do you have to sit at a week? Like, seriously, like, why do we keep doing this? The kind of like boys and their swords type thing. Like, is this supposed to impress you? Like, is this, and have Eleanor kind of think about like, oh, Raymond does this, he has a good time with it, and it's a good way to get rid of suitors. And then just have Marianne say like, it's just part of the role, like, and that way you get her as this like being a little more reserved and guarded, but agreeing in thought, and it'll give them a good connection. So when you move into the conversation with the queen, and the queen's like, she's just here for blah, 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 we feel it a little bit more. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So get them talking. You can keep all the sword play because it's well written. Just put their voices in between and delete these comments that I made because they're getting the swordsman's talking. You don't need that anymore. So get rid of that. And you can keep, because they're not the two people talking, Raymond and the Count aren't talking, you can keep their helmets.
More historically accurate. That was one of the things, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's tough. Whenever you're writing one of these like historical fantasies, you've got communities around them that really like this time period. So yeah.
Maybe I should have said, so it is actually based off of real people. I
Awesome.
changed the names because I thought I changed enough of the details that I probably couldn't quite justify it. But this is based off of Louis IX and Isabel of France.
Oh, perfect.
So
yeah.
the year and the date are accurate to to their ages, more or less.
Yeah, I love that. Right, like I love historical fiction. I think it's great. But you're right. If you're writing historical fiction in a way that your reader might potentially recognize who you're playing off of, and they wore helmets, they have to wear helmets in the piece. So that's a good call. Good catch. Yeah. Because that's part of the reason historical fiction readers show up is because they want to live in the time period. So you've got to keep you got to keep it real. What was I saying here? Okay, so Raymond addressing the crowd. What is Raymond like? What's his voice like?
He doesn't care a whole lot, actually, what the people think, is not as much as Eleanor. He knows that he has a role as prince, but he's much more independent. And there's another duel later that's from his perspective, where you can see this a little better, in that he realizes they want to show, whereas he wants to challenge. And
Gotcha.
those aren't exactly the same thing. So I wanted to minimize his being too much of a like, he's not fighting to show off his skill to them. He doesn't care what they think so much as actually trying to fight in a way that's interesting to him. And there's also some tension too of there are people in the crowd who will get behind him becoming king, and people who will try to grab power every which way they can.
Gotcha.
Undermine him.
So we just need what I was looking for here is a little more understanding of why because you expect the spectating court clapped politely but not vigorously as Raymond accepted the surrender with a curt nod, returned his important sword to him hilt first, and gave him a quick hand up. That's a great sentence, but it doesn't really, it kind of walks the line like you're talking about in between. Is he showboating this whole time? Because he's does the thing where he's fighting with his weak hand, and then he switches and he's, allows the count to come at him for a while before he does. So he's kind of walking that line between like showman and like athlete, and the cross between the two. You need Marianne and Eleanor to comment here on how he handles this goodbye. Right? Like Marianne needs to be like, the least he could do is stay for the applause. So many young women out here would, if he would just, can you think you can get him kind of the equivalent of like, you think you can get him to stick around and sign some autographs some more? And then have her like counter like, but the bad boy thing kind of works for me. Right? Like it's that brashness, but you want Marianne commenting on what he's doing as so the reader can get into his like really get into how Eleanor feels about her brothers using this as like his little athletic game. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that was kind of what I was thinking, but getting to that sooner, like the way she addresses him first. Like,
Yeah.
shouldn't you talk to the guy you just defeated?
Yeah. Something like that. And give Marianne you want Mary as the Hazard character, you want Marianne to have an exaggeration of the voice you want Eleanor to have at the end. So because then she's serving in this scene specifically, she's serving as an engine, and that we're like kind of painting an exaggeration of who Eleanor might become. So give Marianne a lot of declaratory statements that make big assumptions.
Right.
Yeah. And because then that allows Eleanor to think about whether or not she agrees with the assumption and then respond with a couple words. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get into your they come in to talk. Oh, here's a place I want you to work on your back and forths. If somebody speaks to Eleanor, she has to respond, even if she only responds with body language. So the prince received his sword and vaulted over the boundary of the ropes, armor and all, to land neatly paced from the seated princess and her companion. He deserved it, he said shortly. Nora, I hope you have a good reason for. Right? She's got to respond. He deserved it, he said shortly. She has to respond to that. I hope you have a good reason for it, because these are two distinct thoughts. Right? Even if her response is just a nod, we need to know how she feels about he deserved it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because the exchange is about understanding her emotional journey and her expectations being met or faltered by her brother's semi-nonsense. So give us her response here to let us know. And then here, this captain of the guard walks up and interrupts. Just let us know we're interrupting. You do a lot of assuming the reader is more intelligent than we actually are. So tell us when somebody interrupts, because we'll be like, oh. And I find a lot of times as a reader, I tend to assume the writer doesn't know what they're doing. So it's better just to, when somebody interrupts, just tell me. Because they'll be, oh, she did it on purpose, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah, I'm very fond of that M dash at the end of a quotation to make that point, but yeah.
The M dash works at the end of a quotation to make the point. But just follow it up. Just like let us know. Why did I add this? Oh, he needs to say something about, he says, I'll say a prayer for you then, talking about her going, he needs to have just another beat here to like sign off. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I thought of the prayer as kind of like the equivalent of good luck, but yeah, like something else for his rhythm of speech makes sense.
Yeah, if and he doesn't need to say good luck. He just needs to say
Right.
sorry. He needs to be like, well, gotta
Gotta
go.
go.
Yeah. And that'll make that I'll say a prayer for you then land. Right. Like, because when it stands alone, it's like a prayer for what?
Right.
So if you acknowledge that he's leaving, then it's like, oh, because he's leaving her alone.
Right.
Yeah. Have we addressed this? So you have a kind of mixed, it's not bad, it's just complicated, mixed motivations for Eleanor when it comes to what she wants, why she wants the prince to hang out. Part of it is because she just wants to hang out. Part of it is because she doesn't want to face her mother by herself.
Right.
One way to clean it would be for her, see, but her voice is so internal. I just leave it. I was going to say one way to clean it would be for her to say, all right, what, find me after, right? I like to say that out loud, but she's so internal. I don't know that that matches her voice. So I would just leave it alone. Then you come back into telling here where you're laying out for us kind of the scene. We're at the end of a segment. She just finished with her brother. It's not bad. You do, because you have so much prose up here, though, so much exposition up here, it hits a little heavy. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I would ideally you'd get her talking to somebody about this. You'd have like a lady in waiting taking her to the queen. Again, historical fiction, is that real? I don't know. But you kind of walk that anytime you find yourself writing a giant paragraph like this, I would pause and ask myself, can I get it in a conversation?
Right.
Because it'll be more engaging, right? If we get in a conversation. Then you pull up here with this short conversation with the page. What are you trying to I know what I liked about it, but I did like this little interchange. The page, she says he's dismissed. He doesn't seem to know what that means. She like helps him know what that means and then gives him a piece of candy. What are you trying to tell us about her with this moment?
It's actually, I wanted to be kind of a contrast to some of the rest of it, that showing she is capable and she is compassionate when she notices things, but more in the realm of like micromanaging. Like she is actually good with taking care of the castle. She does that. She's capable. And especially, yeah, with a younger character, that she doesn't feel like she understands her role with him a lot better. And yeah, that she can be sympathetic too, not entirely wrapped up in herself and her own problems, that she notices things.
Okay. You're nailing the compassionate here. This little scene with him totally makes us feel like, oh, she takes care of people, right? Like even when they're not necessarily doing their job, she takes care of people. Which is good. I don't know that you're nailing the competence.
Right.
If you want to, and I don't know that at any place in this chapter you nail the competence. That she like we know that like, oh, she understands her role, but the micromanaging I don't think necessarily happens in here. It doesn't. Now you don't have to portray every characteristic of a character in every scene, but this is her opening scene. So if there's things that you want to define her for the reader, right? You want to define that she's tired, she understands her role, but she's tired, right? You want her to define that like she knows what to say, but she holds back, right? You want to define that she's compassionate. How important is it that she's micromanaging? Is that part of her character growth, or is that just kind of a quirk about her?
She's going to have to be queen later. So she is going to have to kind of apply the skills that she has taking care of the castle in a bigger sense. And that's,
Okay.
yeah.
So you need one more beat of a scene in here. It needs to be about the length of this scene with the page. It needs to come after she leaves her brother. I'd put it in between these two paragraphs. and she needs to notice something that's off, and it needs to be something tiny. She needs to call for somebody to fix it. She doesn't need to be mean about it,
Mm.
right? But it needs to be like, a tapestry's tilted a little bit, or something small like that. Like there's a, or like maybe there's a piece, like some kind of knickknack missing from a cove in a hallway, right? She needs to look around. She needs to call over a servant, or she needs to stop this page, and she needs to be like, hey, this is a little off. Could you, after you drop me off, could you go to this person and please tell them to come and fix this? And then he
Oh.
needs to say something like, oh, I didn't even see it. And then she needs to be like, internally, like, this is kind of the burden that I bear, is that I see all of it and I can't let it go. And then she needs to be like, you will, after you've been here for a while, right? Which is not true, but she needs to do that. Yeah. That, if you give us that little beat, I think that'll portray more the competence that you're. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was actually kind of what I thought when you mentioned bringing in the lady in waiting character for her to interact and show things, that she would be an easy person to have a conversation about something that happens later this dinner that Eleanor would be in charge of details for. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard. Like, whenever you're sending an internal character on a quest, like, I mean, I think Tolkien is the classic. You're sending Frodo, an internal and somewhat reserved character, on a quest through the Badlands by himself, right? Like, so you have to have a Sam.
Right.
He needs somebody to talk to who sees the absolute best in him, and who is there to like see him become his best self. In this chapter, though, this is one chapter in a book, but in this chapter, we don't have a Sam. And she's gonna need one at some point. Does she get one?
Yeah.
Okay.
No. The brother is and isn't, and then the
He's on his own
romantic.
journey.
Yeah,
He
he
doesn't
is,
count.
and also the romantic interest both is and isn't. But yeah,
Doesn't count because there's got to be tension between them. They have to like, you have to have the like, will they, won't they get together? This is somebody in the silent moments for her to process with.
okay. I mean,
That's
I part of that was that I wanted the isolation with her. That's why she's so vulnerable too. So she latches on to the sorcerer character
the
identified at the
sorcerer
end.
character would work. Yeah. He would work later as like somebody that she can talk
Yes.
to. You just
Okay.
need her talking to somebody. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
In the absence of that character in this first chapter, you got to give her a scene where she talks to a nobody, like you did, like you're gonna do with Marianne up top, right? Like, you just got to get her. Those character traits are gonna stick if we see them in a conversation.
Right.
Yeah. Um. Okay. This is great. Yeah, I liked. I just want to. So you had Eleanor stood up straighter. Mercy Perry, you're dismissed. She remembered the page was new to the court, having left his family a few months ago, clearly trying hard not to look homesick, even though he often forgot his duties. And don't let me hear the cook complaining that you weren't at hand helping for dinner. So we have kind of her speaking, her internal thought, her speaking, right? We got to shove him in here somewhere. And so I want to shove him here up top to trigger this internal thought.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Right.
If you don't want him speaking, he can just have body language that makes him feel like he doesn't really know where to go.
Mm.
So, but either way, we got to get him interacting with her here to trigger this thought. Otherwise, it looks like she's just making assumptions about him, which isn't what you're going for. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I thought I was thinking with the remember, like she's pulling on information that's not actually apparent there. So there's actually, he doesn't give her a cue, but that she's just connecting like, oh yes, I remember who Pierre is. So before I let him go,
Yeah.
kind of thing. But yeah, I see what you mean of like making it clearer so
Yeah.
that reader can follow.
Yeah, and what you're doing is you're bringing the reader into her journey because she's looking at him and she's remembering something about his appearance is triggering her remembrance of who he is and that he might need this help, right? Like, so give us that so that we are also triggered because we want to have the same experience she's having. Does that make sense? The easiest way is for him to bumble a little bit, especially if he's another one of these hazard characters that's not coming around a lot, right? Like,
Yeah.
let him bumble a little bit and then let her go. And then she seems compassionate, right? So you want to get her like, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. And then I'm going to give him one last kind of like thank you in order to communicate to the reader he appreciates what just happened.
Not just smiling.
Yeah, not just smiling. Well, because part of that is you're also setting up the class structure here. And you're defining, like, we come into historical fiction with expectations of what the class structure is, and we've got some tropes in our head, whether we know it or not, right? There's the queen that's mean to all of the servants, like the princess that's mean to all of the servants and thinks they're less than she is. There's the princess who's like, the tomboy who really wants to be the prince and is completely disinterested in being the princess. And then there's the one that the trope that you have here, which is like more the Cinderella, the like kind and genuine princess who's kind of buried under her responsibilities. By having him say thank you, you communicate to us like this is the class structure trope that we're in. This is the one that's kind that everybody likes, but then is quiet and is kind of in the background. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So play on that. And it's important to do in the first chapter because you are like leaning into those tropes allows you to shortcut some things that you don't like. It makes us go like, oh, she helped the page. She must be nice to the commoners, right? Like, does that make sense? We'll
Right.
make the leap, and then you don't have to give us a scene where she's actually like interacting with the class structure. Yeah. Um, Later you have her by herself doing self-talk where she like talks to herself. It's great, especially for an interior character because it gives the appearance of dialogue when there is none.
Right.
So I let her talk to herself a little bit up here, right?
Mm.
She knew what was coming. She just had to brace herself for it. Then she slipped inside. I'd have her say something like, you've got this, Eleanor, it's going to be okay. Right? Like just give her that like self-talk. It'll engage us more emotionally in what's going on and like connect us to her emotional flow. Okay, how do you feel about those changes to this middle piece?
Makes sense. I mean, I think I tend to I thought of some of the body language as trying to substitute dialogue, but I can see the dialogue making it a little bit more engaging to make it clearer for the reader.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I think in my mind, I thought of some of these things as trying to not make it dialogue, but like in another way. But yeah, I can see it making
Yeah.
more pop that way.
Think about it like a movie. The body language does communicate emotion and expectation. But if the movie's silent, our mind starts to wander a little bit.
Right.
So when you can give her a vocalization, it doesn't need to be a lot, but just to like get our brains engaged in the sound, the like audio texture of what you're writing. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Mhm.
When body language works best as a utterance of dialogue is in the midst of people talking because
Right.
then it really speaks like she's not talking,
Right.
right? When you drop body language in a paragraph of exposition, it takes some of the punch out of it
Mhm.
because it's like, well, nobody's talking. So like this is just more scenery, right? Like
Mhm.
you in essence you kind of turn your character into scenery. Again,
Mhm.
it's not bad. It's just if you since you have her self-talking down below, go ahead and have her self-talking here too. Like make it something she
Right.
does when she's by herself. She talks to herself. It's a good trait for an interior character, right? Like an extroverted character doesn't talk to themselves. They just talk to whoever's around them. So this is a good, like, it communicates like, yeah, we know that shyer interior characters do this. They kind of whisper to themselves when nobody's watching. Does that make sense?
Right. Well, actually, I was wondering about that because you had said something like changing what was an italicized thought to making it actually vocalized.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I guess I could see that making more sense. That isn't how because I do have her thinking in other chapters or having responses that aren't vocalized.
Yeah, you have it right
Um,
here. What a gentle voice, she thought as she swept through the bow, swept into the bow. This kind of italicized thought is a good technique. The problem with it is you're not quite using it enough.
right. So maybe if I introduced it earlier in our conversation with Marianne, where there is that contrast, she's thinking things and
Yeah, and a lot of this is just preference. I like what you're doing with her interior thought in that it's you're doing a really great third person close. I think it's really strong. So I'd hate for you to back off of that and start dropping more, what we would consider like giving her inner thought its own narrative.
Mhm.
Does Raymond have a lot of inner thought in italics?
Yeah, later. I mean, depending, but yes, yeah, as
Okay.
the story progresses.
So it's part of their character voice, right? Like this use of inner thought as in italics, standing that inner thought alone becomes part of their character voice. So I would encourage you to have, if somebody has it, they need to have it all the time.
Mm.
Unless it's a modulation, unless like, oh, this character starts off talking a lot and then as the book progresses, gets silent, then moving the vocalization to interior thought works. But if it's not part of their character growth where they need to stop talking, then I would just I would give it to them all the time. I like what you're, again, this is all preference, but I like what you're doing with Eleanor. I like how her thoughts work right now. I wouldn't want them muddied by italics. I think you're doing a good job. So I'd try to pull it out of her voice when you can.
Okay.
Yeah, and so and I also like, you've got this very competent person who's a little locked into their own head. Um
Yeah.
I find the whispering to themselves charming, but in the end, this is your art. You got to figure out what you want it to look like. Does that make sense?
Right, right.
Yeah. And there's no right answer to this. It's more just like, what do you want to do? What's most comfortable for you to write? Um, yeah. We talked about mom. Mom's great. We want it. So here I want to, you have this kind of build to in their conversation to this emotion. And I want to sit in it a little bit. So the queen nodded and her smile was encouraging but brief as she turned back to the documents before her. You're a princess, Eleanor. You must never forget that. That's who and what you are. You have a duty to the kingdom that comes before all else. Right? She makes this big, like, I'm going to put you in your place in a motherly way, but I am also telling you off a little bit.
Right.
And yes, mother, perfect response. Eleanor said, her voice a little louder and steadier, right? Like nice rising to the challenge. And then you had her immediately ask, may I go? Right? Give the queen another line so that the may I go resonates a little bigger. And the queen doesn't need to say anything new. She can just reharp the same thing. Like, look, someday you're going to be in this chair. And I might be harsh, but I'm doing this for your own good. Then the may I go lands a little bit heavier. Does that make sense?
Mm. I, I didn't want it to sound like Eleanor's, yeah, ducking out too soon, but yeah,
Yeah.
I see what you mean. It's like the queen reiterating something. She did initially say something like, "You're a good princess," and I was like, "I don't know," but
Yeah, I
yeah,
would have pulled that.
too
It's a little too kind. Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't want her being kind. But it is that like And again, this is another trope of the genre where of the fantasy, like princess genre, where we have a well-meaning but overbearing mother, right? So play into it a little bit because your audience will connect to the trope and be like, oh, I feel like I know Eleanor. This is when we start using trope. Like tropes aren't bad. Like people think I say like use the trope and people are like, oh, I don't want to use the trope. You have to do the adjacent possible, right?
Right.
Like the key isn't to create something brand new. Readers don't
Yeah.
actually like new things. They like this is like the thing that I enjoy and it's a little different. So grab onto that trope and show the readers this is like what you enjoy. You've seen the overbearing mother with the princess that's trying to find her own way before, but I'm going to put my own spin on it. And
Yeah.
that's what readers enjoy, right? Like that's what we show up for. That's why we keep writing Jane Austen over and over and over again. We just keep writing her books over and over because we're like, oh, we loved those. Let's just put a different spin on them and make an entire genre called rom-com. But that's right. Like, but does that make sense? So lean into it. Like, give us, especially these early chapters, give us the like, yeah, we know what this is. You know this. This is the journey we're going to start off on together.
Especially as the queen will develop, so having it solid where she starts, that makes sense.
yeah, and like just kind of trigger that, like, hey, here's where we're at with this. And it saves you time too, because you don't have to then go into the like past of their relationship, right? Like you give me this trope and I'm like, I get it. I know who these two are. I'm ready to start the journey, right? Like, here we go. You don't want to do that through the whole book because like
Yeah.
once you get the journey started, that's when it becomes your unique art. But we got to like, it's almost like shaking hands with the reader and being like, all right, here's the field we're going to play on. Like
Right,
these
right.
are the rules we're going to play in. Now
You
let's
know
have a good
these.
time. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know how to play basketball. You know how this works. Now we're going to go play basketball. But yeah. There's a little bit of a disconnect here. I think probably the maid needs to say something else. So she says, please find Prince Raymond and ask if he'll accompany you to the castle. She instructed the maid. She instructed the first maid she found in her chambers. The maid opened her mouth and then shut it and bowed. Wait, you know where he is? She's making a giant assumption there with that shut her mouth and bowed. She's like taking two logical leaps.
Yeah.
As in like the first leap is he's not going to be able to do that. And the second leap is he's gone somewhere else and you know where he's gone, right? You got to bring the reader to with both of those leaps. I had to read it 3 times to be like, wait, what's happening here? So you got to like bring the reader into those leaps. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a nice scene. I would have the maid open her mouth and shut it and bow, and then have her go like, wait, what's wrong? And then have the maid kind of smile and have her be like, all right, where is he? Right? Like, where did he go? And then the maid could be like, well, your highness, I had heard. But like, give us both steps of the logical
Right.
of the
Okay.
leap. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
I was
this,
gonna have it, the maid actually was, not sure. And that's why she just shuts her mouth and bows, because she was like, I should just go and make sure before I say that.
yeah, well, you get that in her vocalization, right? Like you nail that in her vocalization.
Okay.
She's like, I heard that he had just left, right? Like, so you get the like, I'm not sure, I don't know what to say. It's more the logical leaps. We need to be able to track what Eleanor is seeing and feeling.
Yeah.
And it's like being able to track Eleanor's pattern of thought is what I actually care about. I don't actually care about the maid. The maid,
Right,
like
right.
she's just scenery, right? Like she's helping Eleanor process, but I care about Eleanor making those two logical leaps. I need to follow along with her. Yeah. There's an emotional turn here. I just want you to show me the turn. Eleanor crumpled inside, but she could not let the maid see that. And then you had thank you, she said composedly. It works. I just want a little bit more of that emotional flip so that I can
Right.
see it too. And again, it's about like letting me into what Eleanor is experiencing. Does that make sense? Here's the self-talk I loved, right? She says, "You're a princess. You can't cry like this." She tried to rebuke herself. That only made her cry harder. I want more of that. When it's very engaging with her as a character. It's very much like, yeah, Eleanor, I'm with you. Like, so when she's by herself, having her talk to herself, I found very uh it just connected me to her emotionally. So that's what I want more of. Yeah. And that's what anytime you have down here, well, so she's not alone here, but anytime she's alone, I might have her talking to herself. It's actually something you could do. We talked about her talking to the page up here.
Mhm.
It's actually something you could do where she talks to herself about what's wrong and fixes it herself if you don't want to include another character in that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here there's this fun thing where there's a knock on the door and she's like doing self-talk, kind of inner thought about who's at the door, trying before she opens it. Make this knock its own character,
Mhm.
right? You're a princess, you can't cry like this. She tried to rebuke herself, but that only made her cry harder. A knock sounded at the door. Gulping her breath, she wiped her eyes. This was terrible. She couldn't be seen like this. Bring this down on its own line. It's not necessarily grammatically correct, but we want to illustrate this is its own voice in the scene. Again, a knock sounded, not a very loud knock, but insistent. A maid, perhaps. She thinks about who the knock is. Taking another deep breath, Eleanor strode to the door. Better to dismiss the maid. I want a third knock here because we're getting a back, and you can see by giving a third knock and giving its own line, you're giving a back and forth between the knocking and her response. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Sort of
Yeah.
dialogue.
Yeah, it is. She's dialoguing with the knock at the door. Whenever we can get that feeling of an exchange, it's the exchange of emotion with a, typically with another person, but here you're having an exchange of emotion with a sound. That the passing back and forth is what's engaging to the reader, right? Like
Right.
if we break dialogue down to its core, it's that exchange of the back and forth. So if we can take that back and forth and make it into something with a inanimate object, we get the semblance of dialogue. It's not as engaging, but we get the semblance of it.
Right.
Yeah. If you have a sword fight later where no one can talk through it, this is how you do that.
Okay.
Break out the characters like they're exchanging emotions with their back and forth. It'll make it feel more like a dialogue and less like I'm reading this paragraph of exposition. Now, an English teacher may tag you for your grammatical structure, right? An English teacher may be like, no, this all goes on the same line. It's one paragraph. And you can be like, I'm so sorry. Put it all on the same line, turn your paper in. And then when you get it back, make it look like you want it to look. But it's that like, we are breaking grammatical structure here to make that, to give, yeah.
An editor will say there are too many paragraphs and we want shorter
Yeah.
paragraphs.
And look at the editor and be like,
Reader wants that.
yeah, thank you so much for this. And ignore. But yeah, it's you know, we think about grammar as rules. Uh when you start getting into like really writing a novel, and like we see this with the masters all the time, they rarely follow the rules. They see grammar as tools, as like, I'm going to use these structures and conventions to sometimes meet and sometimes defy expectations of what I'm doing on the page. And so, when you give your work to other writers like me, we tend to lean on the rules. This is the way it's supposed to be. But think about, I think writers that are better than I am look at what they're writing and say, like, how do I take those rules, think of them as tools, and then accomplish what I need to accomplish with them. So this is one of those places where it's like, we know that the rule is when somebody talks, you give them a new line. We also know that like when a paragraph goes together, right? Like if there's not a break in the action, the paragraph goes together. Here I'm saying like, let's treat this as if it's somebody talking. and let's go ahead and give it its own line because it creates a feeling on the page that you want to have. So that's just my vent about, like, I know that people are going to dock you for that and be like, no, this all goes together. Just ignore them. It's your book, do what you want. Your ending's really solid. When the wizard shows up, it's great. It's a really good, like,
I'm glad we could tell who he is.
oh yeah, he's perfect. He's fantastic. And again, you're playing on a good trope. The fact that and you're already playing with it, right? The fact you made him old, like you made him, he's already not kind of engaging in the palace appropriate. There's no guard that escorts him to the door. So you're already like, he plays outside he does kind of what he wants to do. But then you have him being very like genuine and sweet. And so you're like, hey, I've got the weird wizard trope, but I'm gonna play with it a little bit and it's gonna be a little fun. So yeah, you tagged me in right at the end of the chapter. I would turn the page and go to the next one to see what's happening. But yeah.
The only disappointment is that you don't see him.
You don't see him for like several more chapters?
Well, until the third chapter, because then I switch.
Oh, that's
to the
fine.
prince. Yeah.
As long as when we come back to Eleanor, he's around, we're good. Yeah. If you turn the chapter and take me to Raymond, I'm like, oh, this is the dude that was sword fighting. Okay. We're in for this now. Yeah, like it's yeah. Just as long as he doesn't disappear until like chapter 16. Because by that point I'm gonna forget him. But yeah,
No.
so yeah.
Yeah. His focus.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's fun and he's a nice character. I mean, you don't give us a lot of exchanges with him, but I can already, from the voice you've written, right? May I come in? I hope I might interest someone with such skill in needlework with some of my own sewing notions, right? Like just the way I'm afraid they didn't have anyone to spare showing an old fellow like me around. So they sent me through with some directions. I haven't gotten too lost though, have I? Are you Princess Eleanor? Your use of questions make him like defer, which is great because it has a kind of like wise politeness to it, which is really nice. And it has a like, I'm not going to force you to do anything, but I'm also breaking all the rules at the same time. It's a really fun character voice. So, and it's going to be perfect for her as like a companion that pushes her out of her internal, right? Like, because he seems to have an internal, but has learned how to communicate it in a compelling way. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So you can see that like, oh, this is a great engine character to help this very internal character communicate her own thoughts and feelings in a compelling way.
Well, okay. So the next so I actually don't give his conversation, and I summarize it because he, he's so I wanted it just like I understand it, and yeah, he does get some conversation where you actually see him, interacting with her. But I'm wondering, yeah, if that's something that would feel cheating if you just get her reflecting on their conversation instead of.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna circle it
Actually
right away.
speaking?
I'm gonna circle it right away and be like, you have to show me this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because it seemed like it was more important that what her reaction was, at least in that, and that I was, moving forward, instead of like, okay, picking up, and especially because I'm telling the story more sequentially rather than like, this was happening meanwhile. The prince is over here doing this, and the princess is, and then I'm going back to where I left her off.
Sure.
Until their stories are, impossible to do like that.
Yeah. So
But
there's no you must or you mustn't, right? Like there's never a you have to. Anytime you summarize something, we're gonna skim it. And we're not going to emotionally connect to it. So the question is like, is it okay to lose that? If it's something that you actually want us to connect to, you want us to, like you said, her reflection on it is more important than actually it. If her reflection on it is important, you better show it to me because otherwise
Okay.
I won't track it. I'll read it and be like, okay, that happened, and then I'll throw it out of my mind and I'll move on to the next conversation. So if it's something you actually want me to engage with, you got to show it to me.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I had something later where she's, yeah, her reflection is her remembering the conversation at least, so maybe something
You
like
could do
that in a
that.
way that, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
you could
not
do that.
happening in real time, but.
Yeah, that delays the like, that's a good technique if there's something that happens in the conversation that you don't want me to know till later.
Mhm.
It's a delay of it. But yeah, or you could have somebody talking to her about the conversation that just happened and having her refuse to give details. That's another good technique to like, a conversation happened that I don't want to show you. Right.
Mm.
But again, like to harp on the point though, summarizing conversations tells the reader they're not important and I don't have to remember them.
Mm.
Right. It is that is when people say show, don't tell, 99% of the time I find that that's what they mean. They mean you summarize the conversation and I need you to show me that, because it's, again, we get to know these characters through their exchanges with one another. So if you summarize exchanges, you tell me you don't need to know either of those characters. It's fine. And so, but then there's, like you're saying, there's summarizing for strategic use, which has to be more artful, a little bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. Anything else you want to talk about before we?
Okay. Well, that's a lot of helpful things. Yeah. We'll make it a longer first chapter, but if you're paying attention to,
Yeah. Who
if you're
cares?
engaged,
Yeah.
you don't care.
Length doesn't matter as long as it's engaging. We'll come at it. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna turn off the recording. We can talk a little bit more.
Okay.